Hello, Blitz fans of all ages, it's me, PlumCastle, and today we are going to be taking a look at some new tanks that should be coming out into Blitz at some point in the future. In other words, tanks that aren't yet released, and we're going to be taking a look at what they actually look like, and more importantly, what their stats are, or at least what their stats are currently, because keep in mind these tanks are going through changes, so theoretically these may not be one-to-one with the statistics that come out with the tank. But with that said, let's not waste any more time and let's dive right into it. So the first one was from my comments section, and they were talking about a particular tank which I'm about to pull up. It is a British premium tank, and if I scroll here, it is the FV 1066 Senlak, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's a very unique looking tank. I don't know exactly when this came into the files, but it's definitely not playable yet, unless maybe you're a beta tester, in which case you probably already know everything about this tank. But either way, it is a very unique looking tank. It is a light tank, which is definitely a bit weird considering the turret is on the back, but that's what it looks like. Now let's take a look at the stats. Firstly, the hit points. Not very many, sitting at 1,200, which is not a ton, especially considering this is a tier 8. If it was a tier 8 in the light, I would probably usually like to see a bit more than that, but I mean, it is a light, so it's not going to have a ton. Armor is there even armor? Not really. I mean, frontal armor of 25 millimeters, really the thickest part on the tank that I'm seeing right now on these numbers here is 25 millimeters. I can't think of too many guns that can't penetrate 25 millimeters with AG, which is not great. I'm sure probably hitting the gun or a track or something is going to maybe absorb a bunch of it, but pretty much everywhere, as far as I can tell, is HEable. In fact, the tracks are pretty wide. I can totally see even large, inaccurate HE shells actually getting into the side between the tracks. I could just totally see that happening. So yeah, this thing is pretty prone to HE from what I can tell. That's, of course, not the best. View range is 250 meters. That's, of course, better than I would have expected for a heavy. I do know of some tanks that have more than that, but 250 meters, I guess that's okay. Concealment is actually pretty good, which is definitely something that's needed for a tank with this little armor. 31 while stationary and 31 while moving. It doesn't lose anything while moving. Now, upon firing, it's a 7, which I believe is still, generally speaking, a better number. But yeah, when you fire, you're probably going to get spotted. But the 31 concealment when moving is actually going to possibly make this tank a very good flanking machine. We'll have to see what its speed is. I'm glancing at it at the moment, and it looks like it's going to be pretty good. And after the concealment, damage per minute, 2,400. That's actually pretty good. It's not 3,000, but it is pretty good. 2,400 definitely means you're going to be able to get a lot of damage out. Average penetration is 205. That's not the most, but for how thin this gun looks, I would actually say 205 millimeters is probably okay. 258 for high explosive anti-tank, so heat rounds. And the HE has 44 millimeters of penetration, so this thing can HE itself, despite how skinny the gun is, which gives you an indication of just how thin this tank is. After that, in terms of the damage output, we're looking at 200 alpha for the AP rounds, 170 for the heat rounds, or really the premium rounds, and then 250 for high explosive. So high explosive is, it's of course not the highest alpha in the world. After that though, aiming time, 3.7 seconds. That's okay. It's generally speaking fairly fast, though I have definitely seen faster. Dispersion is 3.26, which is actually a bit of a lower dispersion than on a lot of tanks I see, so that is nice to see. Gun turn limit, upwards 14 degrees. Honestly, not all that special. 14 degrees is just kind of okay, but the gun depression is 10 degrees, which is actually a fairly decent value. In terms of gun depression, 10 degrees it's certainly not the upper limit, but generally speaking, if you're going to talk about a tank that has good gun depression, 10 degrees definitely falls into that category. And now, here we are at the speed. Now, reverse speed's 23. Probably not all that special, but the forward speed is 69. I'm sure you could do something to make that 70 or maybe even 71, depending on what kind of provisions you have. But even so, nearly 70 kilometers per hour makes this tank very, very quick. And, like I mentioned earlier, if you couple that with the fact that it has great concealment, means that this tank can lickety-split flank around somebody, which is really what its strength is going to be, which makes sense why it would have basically no hit points or armor. Because what I have a feeling is that the goal for this tank is mainly going to be to hopefully not run into other light or medium tanks and just flank all the way around and go completely unspotted and get everyone from behind with your amazing 2,400 damage per minute. That's just what I see. I'm not the best at telling these things just based off of the stats, but that's what I'm noticing. Average speed is 41, of course, reverse and forward combined. I have a feeling you're probably going to be running this tank if you have it about 55 to 70 most of the time if you're driving forward. And then power to weight ratio 25. Personally, I don't notice a whole lot in these types of things. This tank is pretty light from what I can tell, so it's probably not going to really be affected by a whole lot aside from maybe water. However, what is important, at least in my mind, is the turret turn rate and the hull turn rate. Those values are also very high. I would have actually anticipated something like this to have a... It's weird. I would actually anticipate this to have something of a slower turret traverse, but it doesn't. It has 47.98 degrees. That's, if we're being generous and we're rounding a little bit, that's about 50 degrees on the turret alone. Plus another, since we rounded the other one up, let's round this one down. 55 on the hull rate. So overall, if you're spinning both at once, you're getting a good, probably about 100 degrees a second, which is, that's pretty decent. You're getting a little bit over that, to be honest. Over 100 degrees a second when turning around. That means in, what is it, 360, let's just say it's 4 seconds and you've easily turned around completely. That is not too bad at all. However, that is just the first tank. We have one more tank, and I do want to give special credit to Mega Lion 69, as again, he provided this particular image that I'm going to show you of the tank beforehand. So, the Cairnarvon Defender. Now, of the two, personally, I think this tank is going to look cooler, but of course, just because it looks cooler doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be better. Now, this is also a tier 8. It is, I believe, oh, it is a heavy tank. I thought it might have been a medium. So, this is a Defender tank. So, like we have the Defender Mark 1, I believe. There's a ton now. AMX Defender, all that cool stuff. We've got 4 of them. And this looks a lot like the Defender Mark 1. However, this is not the Defender Mark 1. So, let's go ahead and take a look at the stats. Hit points, 1,800. Tier 8 makes sense, having more hit points. Main armor on the front, 240. So, this is on the turret. So, the turret, of course, is going to be very strong. The lower plate there, probably not as much. It is rounded, so that means, or it's angled, I should say. It's not quite rounded. But it will probably bounce a few things here or there, but probably not like super consistently. Its tracks are pretty big. I have a feeling that the front drive wheel is probably going to be very prone to getting hit and damaged and broken all at the same time. It's a little bit hard to tell. It might be just disconnected enough to not do too much, but I have a feeling that that's probably going to be the case. In terms of the rear, in terms of the hull, it's like 35 millimeters, so not really surprising. It's basically going to be a free HE. The rear of the turret, theoretically, could also be done HE into, considering it's only 60 millimeters, and random other stuff like this. So it's not the strongest armor, from what I can tell, but as we can see with the previous tank, armor isn't necessarily going to be everything. So the view range is 240. This is a heavy tank. We're not really expecting to see a whole lot, which I'm also thinking, wasn't the light tank only 250? So maybe that's not a great view range. Either way, this one has 240. Whatever that necessarily means for how good it's going to be at spotting, I have a feeling it's just going to be whatever. It's a heavy tank, like I said. Concealment. Basically nothing. While stationary is 10. Okay. While moving is 5, so that gets cut in half. While firing and stationary is 3. Yeah, the moment you're shooting, you're pretty much getting spotted. That's not necessarily the most fun thing, but being a heavy tank, you're probably in spotting range most of the time anyway, and I just noticed there's some nice electrical effects going on there. Damage per minute, 1,860. It's decent-ish for a heavy tank, I suppose. I've, again, definitely seen higher, but just because I've seen higher doesn't necessarily make this bad, but it probably could stand to be a little bit higher. This has a magazine, though, because being a defender, it naturally has to have a magazine. I don't think there is a defender that doesn't have one. So that's also why the damage per minute would be a bit lower, because this damage output over a short period of time is theoretically going to be better. Magazine reload time, though, is 21 seconds. I'm just going to round off that super low floating variable. 21. That's a fairly long time to be reloading a clip. Now, a lot of tanks have really long reloads on their clips. Emil 1's an example, and many of the other defenders have, I believe, longer. And the individual shell reload time is 3 seconds. So when you fire, it's going to be 3, and let's see, how many shots are in the magazine? Does it show me? We'll find out in a second if it is there. But moving past the shell reload time, oh, there it is. There are 3. So that means over the course of 6 seconds, because you don't load the first one automatically, it's just there. So 6 seconds is how long it's going to take to get all 3 shells out in as soon as they're all loaded. Now, average penetration, 218, it's not the most. 250, again, not the most. And high explosive, 45, again, not the most. These might be like normal values on like a light tank, and maybe even a medium tank. For a heavy, though, I think it probably could stand to be a little bit more. But that, of course, is balancing out with the other statistics. In terms of the damage per shot, we're looking at 280 for AP rounds, 240 for APCR, and 340 for high explosive. So honestly, high explosive is like not a ton more damage, but at the same time, it is still technically more. So if you can penetrate that somewhere, aiming time, we're looking at 4.9 seconds. That's nearly 5 seconds. Yeah, 5 seconds to fully aim in, especially considering that this is a magazine tank where we can have a new shell reloaded in 3 seconds, as long as there is another shell to be reloaded. And when you have to wait 4.9 seconds, it's almost like the interclip or the shell reload time might as well be 5 seconds kind of thing, because if you're not really able to aim in all that well, you kind of want to be close to your targets. However, on top of that, we have a dispersion of 0.345. I see that value a ton, in my opinion. Maybe I just don't look at the dispersion enough to know, but 0.345 feels like a pretty average-ish accuracy. It's probably not the best, but it could technically be worse. Gun turn limit, 17 upwards. That is okay. It's still nothing like super extravagant. However, like with the previous tank, gun turn limit, or really the gun depression, going down 10 degrees. That is, again, like I said earlier, pretty good, especially on a tank like this. Now, in terms of maneuverability and regarding the speed, 30 forwards, 14 in reverse with an average speed of 30. I don't know how that math calculates out like that, but maybe it means it keeps its top speed very well. Either way, 30 is okay. It's definitely not like the fastest or anything. Now, in terms of turret turn rate, we're looking at 29.2 seconds. 29.2 degrees per second. Yeah, I mean, that's about 30 degrees a second. Add to that the 25 or so that you're getting from the hull. You're getting 55 degrees a second, which it's definitely not like super quick, especially compared to the other tank, which could be in excess of 100. Yeah, this is not the fastest turning tank. Again, being a heavy kind of makes sense, but I don't know. So far, I'm just not seeing a whole ton that really sticks out to me other than the magazine and being able to unload a bunch of damage, and I'll do the burst damage here in just a second. Terrain crossing capacity, most of these are just okay. Personally, I don't really do a whole lot with the values in here. I kind of just like to drive a tank and then decide, yeah, that's kind of slow or that's not. But in terms of road, 104, ground, you're definitely going to be going a little bit slower on ground, and then water. I mean, water slows down every single tank, to be honest. But like I said, let's take a look here. So with the 6 seconds, if you assuming you have a full clip to unload all 3 shells would take you 6 seconds. And let's just assume that you're shooting AP. So that is 280. And real quick, I'm just going to bring up my calculator to do this a little bit more quickly. So if we have 280 and we're going to be multiplying that by the 3 shells, and there you go, you get 840 damage over the course of 6 seconds. That's pretty good. Yeah, that's pretty decent. I think the mill one is somewhere around in there. So yeah, you can do a decent amount of damage over the course of a short time, but that is assuming that you're hitting all of them. Looking at the penetration values, you could easily be bouncing a few here and there. And the magazine reload time is super long. It's a kind of a slow tank, doesn't turn around super duper quick. And its concealment's not great. Not that it necessarily needs it, but concealment is always a nice thing to have. Hit points are decent, I'd say. Overall, though, it kind of seems a little bit meh to me. Of course, unless I'm actually playing the tank, it's really hard for me to gauge whether or not it's going to be good. So that's why I show the stats, so you can kind of make a decision on your own whether or not you're going to like a tank or not. But personally, if I was to kind of compare these 2 tanks that I've covered in this video, this tank to me seems much better if you like a heavy tank style. If you like to be able to bounce a shot here and there and have a magazine reload, you're probably going to like this pretty fine. However, if you're a good player and you really like light tanks, then I think the FV, what was it, FV 1066 Senlac. I honestly think if you're a light tank lover, you're probably going to like this a ton more than the other tank, but of course that kind of makes sense. Personally, stat-wise, I think, given what I'm looking at, I actually think that this tank is probably the better of the 2, but harder to play, if that makes sense. So the other one's not as good, but it's easier to play, and then this one would be better, but much harder to play. That's just what I'm getting based on these stats. Again, anything could change. And unless we can actually play these tanks, it can be a little bit hard to tell, but that's what I'm noticing. But anyway, that does conclude today's video, and so with that, I hope you all enjoyed, and as always, have fun, good luck, and happy tanking.